All right, welcome to the June Cyber Look Back here on Bright Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. I am joined with our two subject matter experts here today, where we are taking what was our abstract and completely flipping it up on its head based on the last week of current events. With me today is our threat analysis team lead, Peter Rydzynski, and one of his team members and subject matter experts, Joey Fitzpatrick. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Looks like you guys are in the same room, which is awesome. That hasn't happened in quite some time. So I'm excited to interview you both here at the same time. Now, we are going to mix things up a bit. We're going to do a very rapid news segment where I'm going to pick your brains on the things that have happened in the last week. And then we're going to jump into some of the things that are hitting the national infrastructure in a way we didn't expect. So are you gentlemen ready?
Let's get it. Go.
Perfect. So first and foremost, let's jump into a watering hole. And I'm going to throw a picture up real quick for those of you in the audience. But there's a watering hole that was discovered. Peter, do you mind jumping into this and the organization that found it?
Yeah, so Dragos actually is the company that originally discovered this. And interestingly enough, this actually came out of the old watering hole, or I'm sorry, the old water utility attack where a person attempted to inject a massive amount of chlorine into the water. And in fact, that was caught and stopped. And in the investigation, the background investigation of that, Dragos discovered a entirely separate, very sophisticated watering hole attack that was targeting water utilities across the board. So it was kind of an interesting development to a story that seemed to have been just as simple as one attacker, but it turned out to have uncovered a little bit more. Again, somewhat unrelated, but still worth paying attention to.
Well, and it's always interesting because I think everybody remembers that chlorine attack, right? Where they were trying to dump more chlorine into a water supply, but kind of what's the aftermath of that and what's the follow on that? So this was a great little article. Check it out. Dragos has a good blog post about it. All right. Thank you, Peter. Next up, we to kind of close the loop on another one. You may have heard in the past that someone tried to bribe a Tesla employee. Joey, do you mind jumping into this one a little bit as I bring up the picture?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the quick update here is that the employee that was bribed or $500,000 has actually now been deported back to Russia after serving 8 months in U.S. custody. Pled guilty, only had to pay $15,000, and it could have been devastating for Tesla. Kind of curious where that $500,000 came from. Maybe a Russian oligarch, who knows? But yeah, kind of wild.
Yeah, maybe a Russian. I mean,
well. Yeah, one can speculate, right?
20-some-odd-year-old gentleman trying to bribe somebody with $500,000. Peter, thoughts on this one?
I mean, all I could say is, it's very possible that this person, if they were attempting to install ransomware in Tesla, that indicates they were involved in ransomware prior to that. So this could be proceeds from prior endeavors. Could be pooled together with a bunch of people, and he was just the person who actually reached out. We don't know all of the background on this, but all I can say is, it does beg the question: where did the money come from, and why was he willing to pay so much? And obviously, a big portion of our discussions today is going to be on ransomware, and so we'll definitely be diving into some of the motivations and some of the reasons why this kind of thing is really important to pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Now, Joey, based on this, yes, this happened to Tesla. Yes, this is emerging technology. Do you think this is the only person or Russian on American soil who's trying to bribe people for additional IP?
Definitely not. The insider threat is always there, and we have to prepare for it. So we're going to talk about, like Pete said, a lot about ransomware today. But insider threat, don't sleep on it. Obviously, a big issue.
Yeah, definitely. And shout out to the gentleman who actually reported this. Hopefully he got a little bonus as he's missing out on the $500,000, but he did the right thing. And if you're approached by somebody, we hope you do too. So next up, Peter, I don't have an image for this one, but you've heard of the conflict between Hamas and Israel and how Iran is helping fund that and fuel that war. What we've also now seen and had reports on is this ongoing cyber war at the same time as a physical conflict is occurring. Peter, do you mind touching on some of the details of that?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. It actually started off where, this group tracked as Agrius began targeting Israel back in December. This is, along the lines, same time frame of when tensions were pretty, high between just Israel and generally the Muslim world. And so, this is all in line with that. The attacks seemed to be initially fairly espionage-based, information gathering and strategic from that perspective, but they have since moved on to a more destructive phase. And this is, again, nothing new for Iran. They've actually been probably the most active in the destructive malware space. And this is just another reminder that Iran is willing to use this capability to leverage power within cyberspace. And as we see an increase in ransomware and this kind of thing, this is another angle of that, where ransomware is financially motivated, but destructive malware could very easily be not financially motivated, and we should expect to see further developments in this
space. Now, it's really interesting because it's kind of all over the news. Iran is hitting Israel. I actually saw some news articles while digging into it, Joey, that Iran's internet has been disrupted by Israel. Joey, is this something you would expect from Israel? And do you have any doubt it was them?
Yeah, I mean, Israel is definitely highly trained, and they're one of the top contenders when we talk about cybersecurity. It's hard to say, but I imagine tit for tat's going to continue to happen in the future. Yeah,
absolutely. Especially if, they're seeing attacks from Iran. I think the reciprocation is to be expected, especially in a time of war, physical, especially, right?
Right. And I link a lot to cyber as it's just the continuation in a new domain to espionage, right? It'd be a pretty unrealistic to not think that every other country is not in your network on some level, right? And so the idea that there's Israelis in an Iranian network and vice versa, I mean, that would make sense to me.
To be expected. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Joey. Peter, back over to you. We've had the Colonial Pipeline. We'll touch on that in a minute. We're going to talk about JBS towards the end of our segment, but we're seeing a lot of ransomware around the world. It's working. Do you mind touching on a few of the other people who have been impacted by ransomware?
Yeah, this one's tough because it's hard to say if attention for these types of attacks has increased so much that we're paying more attention and we're seeing more of them, or if they simply, if we actually are seeing a market increase. I personally think it's more on the side of the former, because I think the volume, or I should say the significance of the companies that have been attacked in the recent past has increased the awareness and focus on this as an issue. Obviously, we've got the Colonial Pipeline hack, as well as right on the heels of that, we had Conti ransomware hitting the Ireland healthcare system. Additionally, we've had attacks on things like the Steamship Authority out of Massachusetts, which is the largest ferry service out there. Additionally, we've got, even just yesterday, some new news about the REvil group that's targeting unpatched Microsoft Exchange servers with a new sophisticated PowerShell mechanism to drop ransomware and prep the hosts. So, we've got a lot of attention, a lot of recent attacks that are being talked about quite a bit. But honestly, I think this is kind of sort of business as usual, if you will. And it's really just the fact that the targets themselves are bringing more attention to this.
100%. Now let's talk about ransomware, because, we had a segment last month. There's a lot of stuff that's evolved since then. We saw Colonial Pipeline pay the ransom. And then a day later, the dark side crypto wallet was compromised and all of their crypto was stolen. There's been a lot of speculation around that. Joey, let's head over to you on this one. Should Colonial Pipeline have paid the ransom, or should they not have?
I'm always so torn on this, right? Because I feel like, if I'm a small business, I think it's easy from a simplistic standpoint to say, hey, never pay, right? If you cut the funding from this, it'll stop the oxygen to the fire, right? And that's where we need to be, right? But if you're a small business and it's all you have, and that's your database, and that's like your crown jewels, do you not pay? And then that's it. You have to start from scratch again. That's really, really tough to say. But if you're a utility company, right, and they don't have the crown jewels, I mean, maybe you can get away with not paying it, right? And there's been discussions about, how does the government step in? Cyber insurance, right? I felt like personally, cyber insurance has kind of been helping fuel the ransomware, right? Because now there's a guaranteed payment system. But as we saw in the past few weeks, insurance companies have actually said we're no longer going to pay ransomware. So I think that's going to be interesting moving forward here.
Yeah, and they're increasing their premiums, right? So you can't just go in and, and there's even cybersecurity insurance companies going out of business because they're paying out so much. So it's an interesting, teeter-totter where it's going to be more affordable to implement actual security controls than to just buy insurance and to offload that risk to an insurance company. So really interesting stuff. Now, Peter, real quick, I got to ask, because the FBI was involved in this Colonial Pipeline one from the beginning. They must have discussed with the FBI whether they're going to pay the ransom. The FBI probably said, okay, like based on what they have encrypted, let's pay it. Let's get the decryption keys. Was it speculation, please only, but was it the US government who went out and then tracked where this crypto went and stole from DarkSide? Or was this the Russian government saying, hey, you attracted the wrong attention, we're taking our cut?
It's very challenging to speculate given the utter lack of information on that end of it. We know a lot about all of the details of the group and the circumstances and this kind of thing, but as far as the decision-making process and what groups are even allowed to be involved, because to be honest, I'm not even sure if the FBI could have a say in whether the ransom was paid or not, only insofar that we have seen the federal government step up and say, if you pay a sanctioned terrorist organization, you're going to be in trouble, just like you would in any other circumstance of feeding money to a terrorist organization. But beyond that, if this isn't labeled a terrorist organization, which given the fact that it came out of Russia, and I don't know of any Russian groups specifically that are labeled as terrorist organizations, I'm not sure that they would have any authority to say anything. And so it is a challenging thing to speculate. But I can also say, given the severity of that attack and sort of the impact that it had, we already saw before there was even a shortage of oil, we saw people hoarding, and we saw a shortage that was simply due to the fact that gas stations were selling. I heard in one anecdote that a particular gas station had sold something like 3 days worth of gas within a few hours. And so no matter what circumstance you were in, even if we had full supply properly, running, that would still be an issue. And so you can see the panic that would have ensued if the FBI were to have said, nope, don't pay that ransom. In fact, I think it's an argument that you have to accept as valid of, we may actually want to, in certain circumstances, actually go forward and pay that ransom just to get systems back online quicker.
To go down that road, imagine if that would have been, what if they said like, hey, we won't pay the ransom, but if we don't pay, we'll be out for another 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, what is the economic cost of that? I think they ended up paying what, $5 million, whatever it was.
4.4 or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that has to be in the millions of dollars worth of like the whole East Coast coming to a grinding halt. Oh, by the way, it helps fuel the military bases and, national defense, right? So
national security implications.
Yeah. There's some strategic stuff there. So.
Well, it's really interesting because I know we're going to get on this topic again later, and we do have to wrap up this news segment here shortly, but I want to come back to that thought, Joey, so keep that thought. Now, Sophos did a really good breakdown of the DarkSide organization, and it was really interesting because you've probably heard, advanced threat actors have hundreds of days of dwell time in your network before they're detected. Right? I mean, everybody's heard that. Well, they actually did research, and they really mapped out all the tools that DarkSide was seen using, but they mapped out exactly how long they were in network. So let me go ahead and show this. And so check out the Sophos write-up. They did a really good job, but they tracked the metric, and the minimum dwell time before executing the ransomware itself and encrypting resources was 44 days. So about a month and a half. And the maximum time they were actually dwelling in your environment was 88 days. So a month and a half to 3 months. Let's talk about this really quickly. Peter, is a shorter dwell time a good thing? Or do we prefer the longer dwell time? Like, how does that land on you?
Yeah, so we've in the recent weeks since this reporting, we've been dealing with a lot of misconception around what dwell time means, and what you should look at dwell time from 2 angles to help clarify this. You should look at dwell time from 2 angles. One, from the angle of how long, as an organization, a defensive postured organization, how long am I allowing an actor to dwell in my network? And we can track that dwell time from our perspective. From the attacker's perspective, we can track the dwell time instead as when the minute they landed on my network and phished a user, got access to the second that ransomware was deployed, and then they moved out. That's the dwell time of the actor. And essentially what we're trying to do is make sure that our detection dwell time is lower than the actor's dwell time, because then we prevent that final actions on objective from ever occurring. And so there's been some misconception where people immediately saw these headlines and said, yay, security organizations are winning. We're reducing dwell time. This is great. But in reality, what they were demonstrating in this research was attackers have actually shortened their dwell times because they don't need as long on target to necessarily monetize that. They can make full domain compromise, achieve full domain compromise, deliver ransomware, and move out within, as you said, sometimes 44 days. And so if our dwell time calculations, the last few years have been upwards of 6 months for detection, we're well underneath. We're not detecting that. The attacker is well underneath your detection average detection time. So it's actually somewhat troubling news to see that attackers are moving more rapidly, because it makes our job as defenders harder.
Well, and they've got the practice, right? This is not their first rodeo. It may be your first rodeo detecting these advanced threat actor behaviors, but they do this to multiple organizations, right? They're pivoting, they're getting full domain access. So we talk about this month and a half dwell time, and we get the question all the time, like, what do I do to prevent ransomware? Like, what do I, and the answer from what I heard, Peter, was once the ransomware happens, it's too late. Like, you really have to focus on the detections during that month and a half to 3 months. You have to be active. You have to be diligent. You have to do your due diligence in your network to really detect this before the ransomware executes. Did I hear you correctly?
You did. And one thing I'll just point out, as you did right there, Joel, is there is a silver lining to this, which is that the dwell time is still pretty significant. You do have some time. I mean, 44 days is still fairly significant. Granted, there are times where that's not 44 days. And so we can't just assume that you have at minimum 44 days. But we can at least say that dwell time is still long, and there is a lot of opportunity for detection of these initial stages of the attack. Obviously, as you mentioned, we really need to get a grasp on phishing. We've got to get a hold of our external public-facing servers and VPNs and this kind of thing, the gateway into the networks. We've seen that become a significant problem in the last few years. And so it's these initial steps that we really want to focus on. And then, as you mentioned, once they gain a foothold in our network, are we detecting their C2? Are we detecting their lateral movement? Because that's our opportunity to stop this, maybe even as they're deploying ransomware, but before they execute it.
I love it. Now, Joey, last question, I promise. On to the next one. This is no longer your grandmother's ransomware, right? They're not clicking a link and encrypting your family pictures and asking for $500 crypto. What are these actors looking for when they're in the network?
I mean, everything, right? So it's no longer just like you said, like, hey, we're gonna encrypt your box, and now you're out of luck, right? Your laptop. They're actually pivoting throughout the network, and they're documenting everything. Sometimes better than the sysadmins even know, right? So maybe when you get that data back, you can ask for the network map, right? No, but seriously, like, they're going to find out where your crown jewels are. They're going to get domain level access. They're going to get access to your databases, access to who the decision makers are, right? When we talk about this with DarkSide, right? They already know before they hit your network who makes the decisions, right? And that is fascinating from an intelligence perspective. So, yeah, they're going to go after everything. They're going to use double, triple extortion.
Well, and I forget if it was DarkSide or another group, but literally when they're negotiating the ransom with the person the organization who was encrypted, they were saying, look, we'll provide you with a pen test report once you pay your $5 million. And it's like, it's unbelievable. That's a really expensive pen test report, right? Please get a pen test before you get ransomed.
Right.
But good stuff. Thank you, Joey. All right, on to the last one, and then we're going to hit our main segment, Nobelium. Let's talk about it. I'm going to throw up a picture real quick. The headline says Microsoft is warning us of a Russian Nobelium phishing campaign. Joey, will you walk us through this one real quick?
Yes, this stems back from the Russian hack earlier this year, right? We knew they were in our networks, and we knew it's going to be a while before we kind of pry them out of it. And so this goes into kind of like how deep they kind of permeated throughout our networks, right? And so we actually did a blog post on this about, I think, 2 years ago. We did this about SignGrid, but basically there's marketing tools out there like MailChimp, SignGrid, Constant Contact. And what you're able to do from a marketing perspective is you're able to send out emails. Looks like it's coming on behalf of your domain. So there's some domain validation that happens there. And so basically what you're able to do is send out emails, and then marketing can say, hey, who opened it? Did they open that email? Did they click on it? What device, right? Super useful for marketing, right? So what happened here was Russia actually got into the Constant Contact account of USAID, and they're able to send out malicious emails, and it looked completely legitimate, right? Because it was coming from their account. And so why would you not trust it, right? We tell our users all the time, hey, check the domain. And if it looks legit, right, and it is legit, then it's legit, right? You can trust the sender, right? Here's where training kind of doesn't calculate for that, right? Where now, yeah, we trusted it, people clicked on it, and oh, by the way, now it's malware. And so what's interesting in this attack is there's 4 variants of malware. The first one is Envy Scout, and basically this is a malicious HTML JavaScript attachment using the spear phishing attempts in the emails. And what it does is it basically steals your NTLM credentials and it drops a malicious ISO onto your computer. What happens is it uses the file command in the browser to actually go out, and because your computer is thinking it's going to send it over 445 and open up a file, perhaps when they say a file share or whatnot, when it goes out to this website to an IP address, it actually sends the NTLM credentials over to the adversary computer. And when it does that, then they can take those credentials and then crack them. So that was the first one. And then also in the ISO, there's an executable there called boom.exe. This is the Boombox Malware. And so the purpose of this malware is to download 2 encrypted files in the affected device from the Dropbox. In there is the DLLs and executes them using run DLL, which makes sense, right? This is where they do the reconnaissance phase. This is where they're doing the LDAP queries. They're getting the same account name, the domain, and so forth and so on. They can actually start fingerprinting who the end user is that they compromise, and this ends up getting back to the server. The final 2 malware is Native Zone and Vapor Rage. So for Native Zone, this is where the malware is dropped and configured by Boombox to actually be persistent. So it starts every time the user logs into Windows, and then Vapor Rage is the one that actually helps connect back to the C2 server, gets the shell code, and then you get Cobalt Strike Beacon. So not good.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so real quick, once again, you mentioned at the beginning, hey, this looked benign, right? Based on the training we're giving our employees, like they wouldn't have known. And like this, it brings me back to SolarWinds. Like these actors are able to build things that look legitimate, right? They signed the code, they signed the update. So as a sysadmin, you trust it, right? You're now trusting these attackers and they're deploying malware in your environment. So it's just all the more reason that we're doing our due diligence on our network, looking for anomalies on a regular basis, whether it's from our updates, from our endpoints, right? We have to do better due diligence on this.
Right. And I think this is like initial access in terms of like insider threat. So if you're insider threat, you would have missed it because you already trust that entity the same way they would have trusted this email. And so you have to look at the other parts of the kill chain of, okay, we can't get to initial access. Where else can we catch them, right? Mm-hmm. So.
No, great ad. Well, thank you, Joy, for running us through that real quick. I think that really leads us into our final segment. And this is what probably is dominating the news cycles right now. We really want to dig into this. Let me go ahead and pull up a quick image for you. JBS. So immediately, on Monday, there was an intrusion infecting JBS. This is coming from CISA, and they began working with the FBI to understand the intrusion. It was then verified that JBS was impacted by ransomware. Peter, do you mind walking us through this really quick?
Yeah, this is just another case of sort of, again, I hate to say it, but business as usual ransomware that is getting increased attention due to the target that was involved. In this case, it did appear to be the REvil group. So once more, appears to be out of Russia. However, this is not necessarily confirmed. And I believe this was only connected due to a few loose indicators. And so it's difficult to say 100% whether this was indeed REvil because they didn't, it's unclear what malware specifically currently was used to do the encryption, which is typically our good telltale sign in these cases as to who it was behind this attack. But nonetheless, it looks like a ransomware demand of $4.5 million. So pretty in line with what we've been seeing in the past few months as well. But the good news in this case is that despite the what appears to be fairly sophisticated and complete takedown of the JBS network, which included it basically stopped all production plants from operating, which is obviously what the ransomware group was going after. Despite all of that, it seems that JBS had a pretty smart and sharp security team that was able to put solid backups in place and have a backup and remediation process ready to go prior to this event. Because actually on Tuesday they said right away, which was I think was about 48 hours or so after the ransomware. They were able to fully, come back online for the most part. With a significant progress was made. They said the vast majority of their plants would be operating at full capacity again. So all said and done, the impact was much, significantly reduced compared to some of the other stuff we've seen But the thought is still there that this is just like Colonial, where can you imagine what would have happened if, say, for 5 days or so, we had the news cycle spinning out of control about a meat shortage across the entire Western world. I mean, we're talking like Canada, the United States, South America, Australia. You've got a lot of players in here that were affected by this, and I think I think you would have seen a very similar situation as we did in Colonial, where people began to hoard, and even in normal circumstances where the supply chain was totally fine, you would see demand outpace the supply that we normally have, and so that would just exacerbate problems and turn it into an exponential issue. So it is fairly worrying to see this kind of attack show up right after we saw such significant attacks, including Colonial and the Ireland attack and such. So I am definitely troubled by that, but encouraged by the response that JBS was able to provide.
I love it. So let's go back to this picture real quick. So I think you guys have been harping on this the whole episode. And I love it. Keep it up, right? I mean, because even CISA says it in their bottom tweet. They say, regardless of the ransomware actor or strain, good cyber hygiene is highly effective in reducing the impacts of an intrusion.
Yes.
Right. I mean, even they're harping on it. I think it just goes to show that we have to focus on the cyber hygiene, because these incidents are going to happen. And if we have good cyber hygiene, we can tell when something is happening at the network level when it shouldn't be. So let's jump over and and I apologize for the quality of this image, but let's take a look. I mean, JBS, it's impacting meat processing specifically in the US and Australia. Look at all the meat processing plants that have been closed. I mean, they are one of the biggest suppliers. It's been said that they run about 20 to 25% of the meat processing plants or production in the US. Joey, I want to ask you a question though. Imagine if this type of attack was paired with an actual physical emergency or disaster. What would the impacts of something like this be?
Oh gosh. Yeah, completely exasperate. I mean, that's where you can kind of get wild, right? It's just in the sense that like these what if scenarios where imagine if this is during hurricane season, right? I think we talked about this yesterday, actually, right? With the oil pipeline, right? So now production is closed off because, you don't want people working during hurricanes, but also, now there's attack on the pipeline. So now it's just exasperated. Same thing with meat, natural disasters. I think, and taking that a little bit further too, I mean, this could be a test for something bigger, right? And not to the fearmonger here, right? But that is something we need to consider, is that there are industries, there are companies that we have not considered to be critical. But as we've learned the past few months, it turns out they're incredibly critical for our livelihood as we know it. And then with the rise of, obviously globalism and how the world's connected. I mean, here's an Australian company, right? And it's completely impacting the whole North America.
And it's really interesting to see that, wow, these supply chains that we would never expect a cyber attack to impact in this way are being impacted. Peter, let me ask you a question. Like, let's take it back a few weeks before JBS, before Colonial. If I asked you, like, what are the 3 sectors, Peter, that would be most impactful to society if it was ransomware, what would you have said?
So I'm going to say what the greater community was focused heavily on, because we as experts know where the impact would be greatest, even if we don't see it. Where others, I think, outside of who people who pay attention to security on a regular basis, may underestimate the impact that a cyber attack could have. But people were heavily focused on financial sector attacks, stopping things like financial payments and potentially losing financial asset tracking, and things like that. But then additionally, we have healthcare. We've seen a ton of healthcare ransomware, and there was a lot of ethical, moral discussions around, what happens when somebody dies because they weren't able to receive healthcare because the healthcare system was ransomware? Do we then, start roping in murder charges or some kind of sort of traditional crime, criminal penalties for these actions because they actually do have kinetic effect? Same thing happened with public schools and universities and things, where we saw, again, somewhat of a moral, ethical discussion that was brought up around the impact that you have if you ransomware a school. In fact, we saw this in Baltimore, which hit pretty close to home for us last year. I think it was last year during coronavirus, actually. Now that I think about it, it was during coronavirus and everything. So you had kids who just could not, you don't have Zoom up and running. You had kids who were already impacted by a lack of being able to come into school, and then you ransomware everything, and it's just, it brings up all of these moral and ethical discussions. And so I think people were heavily focused in that capacity because it's easy to understand when you're not paying attention to this every day, where now it has shifted completely to a totally different circumstance where we are noticing, and this is an interesting little nuance that we need to tease out, but we're noticing that our supply chains are a little less resilient than we had expected, and that even non-nation states but financially motivated criminals can take advantage of weaknesses in our supply chain that have great impacts on our daily lives. And something that I found funny as I was going through this research was, it brings some confusion around supply chain, because we've been talking about supply chain attacks from a software and hardware perspective as a means of entry for attackers. We got to watch out. Our supply chain is not resilient to attackers injecting code. We saw SolarWinds. We saw a couple others after that, actually, that were like pseudo supply chain attacks and things like that. But now we're kind of focusing on supply chain attacks that are actually attacking our supply chain itself. So an attack that impacts our food delivery, our energy supply, our transportation capabilities, our communication capabilities, and these kinds of things. So I think there's now, sort of double angle on supply chain, where we need to focus on actually defending our supply chain from injection as well as from direct attack itself.
Well, and it was really interesting. So even if I think back a year ago, like, the things that the world was worried about was very much APT, nation states hitting, intentionally damaging, like Iran to Israel, intentionally damaging your energy supply, your water supply. And like, we saw this year go by, and who hit the water supply? It didn't turn out to be APT level threat actors. Dark side, okay, state encouraged, but not state sponsored, right? So it's really interesting to see that ransomware is almost more of a threat from these smaller actors than an APT or, we said nuclear or physical threats are to our critical infrastructure. But thoughts?
Yeah, that delineation is really important, though, right? Because if I can tie you back to this random group out of Russia, it's harder for me to go back to Russia and say, hey, what the heck, right? As opposed to if it's an APT out of Russia, and I know it's Russian sponsored and it's a completely government hacking group, then it's like, absolutely, that's nearly active war. If you're poisoning our water or turning off our lights and hacking hospitals, that you're killing people now, right? That's a big deal, as opposed to a hacking group out of Russia, and the Russian government goes, yeah, we didn't know them, sorry.
Yeah.
And so this brings me, I had a really interesting talk with one of the ISACs this week, and they were talking about Russia and China being kleptocracies. Or nations that make a living from theft of IP and stealing, information from around the world. Peter, talk to me a little bit more about that, because we're seeing these smaller groups in Russia going, oh, not our problem. It wasn't us, right? It wasn't our government. Was it? Is it the culture they've created? Talk to me about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring it up, because I do think there's a couple angles we need to discuss around that. Is firstly, there's the point that Joey made up, or that Joey brought up, that was we need to look at this as potentially associated with some probes to how strong is the U.S. supply chain. How strong are our adversary supply chains? Granted, we can get in there and we can ransomware it, but how quickly are they able to bring that back up? How much time do we have? This is great intel for the Russians if they were to, for them to figure out, if we want to perform some kind of operation, how long can we buy ourselves of downtime if we shut down an oil pipeline? How long can we expect food supplies to be impacted if we were able to shut down a meat processing plant, and that side of it? But then there's your angle, Joel, which is, this is a kleptocracy, if you will, which is very scary, because if you look at it from that perspective and you think about the fact that we have a situation where a country like Russia has actually fairly small GDP. If you look at it, they have a GDP that is not even bigger than some of our United States, some of the states in the United States. And so, when you consider the fact that we've seen Russia involved in how many ransomware attacks in the recent months, and we're talking millions of dollars moving that way, that actually makes a fairly sizable portion of GDP. And then if you consider the fact that this doesn't honor any tariffs or anything, this is just a direct payout right to a Russian citizen that can then inject that money right into their markets. That's awesome for the Russian economy that's clearly struggling from sanctions and all sorts of different things that the United States has been trying to put in place. And so this is actually a subversion of a lot of the financial pressure that the United States has been trying to put on the Russian government. And so, regardless of whether this is directly sponsored by the Russian government, we don't necessarily think that, but the fact that they're sanctioning this actually has some merit from a perspective of they are subverting financial pressure. They are gaining a fairly substantial portion of GDP that they can inject into their economy. It's significant, and we should look at that as a serious threat.
No, I agree. Joey, give me some thoughts on this. I know we had a lot of internal discussion, but okay, it's a serious threat. But what do we do about it? As private citizens, is it just implement more security controls? I mean, there are actors around the world who aren't being held responsible. North Korea, China, the US. What do we do?
Yeah, I think there's the two main entities here, the private sector and the government, right? And for the private sector, we have to do better. We have to increase the cost to play, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, we know in the future, right, APTs and other ransomware groups are going to go after our businesses, right? It's fact. And so if you know that, we have to increase the cost to play so that we can increase our cyber hygiene, right? And if we increase the cyber hygiene, then it's no longer going to be as easy for a ransomware group to hit 10 companies this year. Maybe they only hit one, right? And that's a huge win. And the government side of things, we need to think about how do we strengthen and how do we push back on these groups, right? Is that through more regulations on Bitcoin or whatever coin wallet they have, right? So that's not as easy. Is it that we strengthen a cyber alliance, right? Similar to NATO. And we say, hey, if your country is hosting that malicious server, we're going to get together, within 24 hours and take that server down. And we saw that with the hack a few weeks ago, right? FBI came in with the NSA and they said, yep, server's going off, right? Because that was a US-based server. So I think it's both entities, right? Cyber hygiene and then strengthening our cyber alliances.
Yeah, I love it. And the cyber alliances, right? We talk about the government forming cyber alliances a lot. But man, I love seeing what these ISACs and these communities are doing to share faster, to do better, to work more together. So I think that's great insight, Joey. So I'm going to come back around. I want to get closing thoughts from each of you gentlemen today. It's already 37 minutes into this. So thank you, folks who are watching this. Thank you for joining us. I know we didn't get a lot of questions in today. There was a lot of news to cover, but please, 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 if you have questions, reach out to Peter Rydzynski, Joey Fitzpatrick, or myself on LinkedIn. We'd love to follow this discussion with questions on social media. Now, let me do a quick recap. Then Joey, to you, and Peter, you'll close us out today. So we touched on Dragos, right? So we touched on cybersecurity companies. We still have to stay alert. We have to be attentive. There are things that are impacting not just people, but organizations around the world in more sophisticated manners. So it's up to us to be diligent. Also, we touched on Tesla, right? The briber is being deported to Russia, but it's up to each and every one of you, right? If you're approached for a bribe, trust me, it could be from, if you have any role within your company, you could be approached for this. Do your due diligence, protect your organization, do what's right, and report it, just like this Tesla employee did. From there, we touched on all kinds of ransomware, and it kind of came back, and each of you touched on this point, is it comes back to good cyber hygiene. What are you doing today to improve your cyber hygiene? So that tomorrow when something hits you, okay, it may still compromise. There's still an exploit you didn't know about. You didn't get the patch done in time. But what can you do to minimize the effects of that intrusion? Then we touched on the dwell time, right? We're talking 44 days to 88 days of dwell time because they don't need 250 anymore. And Peter, you mentioned that's almost a scarier fact, and we have to be doing our due diligence. Then we touched on some cyber espionage between Israel and Iran. We touched on Nobelium and how, once again, they're getting more sophisticated. And then finally, JBS and how sectors that we didn't think would be the most critical are now impacting social and countries more than we thought possible. Joey, closing thoughts?
Yeah, my closing thoughts are back to kind of like the cyber hygiene notion. We need to make sure we're exercising our blue teams, right? Cybersecurity isn't just yeah, we got some analysts, we have some security tools, good to go, right? We need to actually exercise. Okay, let's run through. We're just hit by ransomware. Let's actually go through our backups. Not do we have backups, not do we have offsite backups, on-site, whatever. Let's actually run through, take things offline, right? In a test environment, whatever. Actually reload those backups and make sure they work, right? We need all those types of scenarios. Prior military, you have to run through these. You have to not just whiteboard them out and actually just check the box, right?
Yeah, we have to make them habit, right? It needs to be part of our living process in our organizations. Thank you, Joey, for being here today. We appreciate you. Peter, close us out for today.
Yeah, I really like that note that Joey just left there. And I would just say I'd love to look at JBS versus Colonial as a case study. It'd be really cool to see, given the temporal relationship there and the significance of both of their operations. And I'd love to see their response, which I doubt we will, but I would love to see a case study that compared and contrasted the two responses, including how they negotiated with the terrorists in this case, the hackers. But we did actually receive one question here that I think is a great point. So I'm not sure who this came in from, but we did get a question that said, server goes off, they just move to a new domain, quickly set up a new one. How do we defend against that? You're absolutely correct. In the case of ransomware, however, I would argue that rapid action to take servers down is a good thing, and is actually something that would make a market difference, because obviously in the case of ransomware, typically they'll deploy a single domain for that particular attack. And so you don't see this quick shift. But obviously in subsequent attacks, we do see a quick shift. And all I would say to that is a quick plug for behaviors. In this case, if we can't use IOCs, we need to use behaviors. And if we know, which we've seen time and time again, code reuse occurs, direct malware reuse occurs. We're seeing Cobalt Strike everywhere. Yeah. In these cases, we're seeing PS exec and lateral movement. That's just the same every time and time again. It's cookie cutter, not necessarily the direct IOCs, but the actual actions taken are. And we need to address the fact that behaviors are a phenomenal avenue to teasing that out. And so I think, obviously there's a place for threat intelligence and standard operations, but we do need to have the ability to say, regardless of all other variables, we have the ability to fingerprint, if you will, what an attacker does versus what a benign user would do or an administrator within a network would do. And then just to throw on top of that, we need to be able to actually share these behaviors. We can't just be in a silo saying, great, JBS, we dealt with this. We've fingerprinted this behavior. We will never be hit by, the R evil group again if they use this ransomware sample or this particular malware or these techniques. We'll catch them every time. But why is it only JBS? We need to be operating as a collective to ensure that we have the ability to defend every organization with the knowledge that JBS gained. And this goes back to that case study. I mean, that's a big part of it as well. I would love to see that included, but additionally, we need to understand what occurred in great detail in a behavioral sense so that we can build in those detections onto other people.
I love it. And I don't think anyone could have said it better. So hopefully we get that data, and maybe we'll bring you gentlemen back to do that side-by-side comparison someday. Once again, thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here, and let me pick in your minds. Thank you for joining us and watching this June Cyber Look Back. Join us on July 1st for July's Cyber Look Back. We will see you then. Peter, Joey, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Hell yeah.
Finally in person. See you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.